Hi, my name is Werner. I'm a professor of Urban and Community Forestry at the University of Wisconsin-Stevens Point. Our department is housed within the College of Natural Resources. And what we want to do today is kind of give a little bit of a demonstration as to how to properly plant a tree. Within our urban forest, we do three things with a great amount of regularity: plant trees, prune trees, and remove trees. Of those, we have a tendency to do two of them poorly, planting and pruning. And so what we're going to go through are some instructions that are going to make sure that when you put trees into the landscape, that they are going to be there for a long time and not going to be compromised by what we do during the planting process. I'm assisted today here by Eden Stern. Eden is a graduate student in forestry, specializing in urban and community forestry. She's got a really neat project that's looking at some canopy stuff across the state of Wisconsin, and is working with Dr. Rich Hauer, my colleague in urban and community forestry at Stevens Point. So the first thing that we need to talk about before we get into planting, the actual physical part of the planting of the tree, is to talk about the site. Here we are in a beautiful October day where the temperature's in the maybe low 30s, kind of a little bit abnormal, but we've got a clear vision of what this site is. And you can see that I've got this red line going down this boulevard. Anytime I am going to be planting a tree, and this applies to even if it's in your backyard, please use a utility locating service to identify gas, electric, anything underground that might cause a conflict with this. In Wisconsin, we have Diggers Hotline. Call Diggers Hotline. Give them a week or so notice prior to when you're going to plant. They'll come out and they'll mark the utilities for you free, and then that way you can be assured that you aren't going to have any unexpected conflicts when you start preparing the planting site that's there. The other thing is, as you can see, that I've got the site here kind of prepped for where the tree is going to be placed. I don't necessarily like to call it a hole. I like to call it a planting site, because what I'm trying to create is an environment that is going to allow that tree to successfully establish itself after I plant it into the ground. The size of the site that I'm planting is going to be roughly 2 to 3 times the size of the package that the tree is being delivered in. So in this particular case, my site is about 2 times the size of this ball, and you can see that it's kind of slanted in. It's not a straight-sided hole that goes all the way down. All right, I said previously that one of the things that when we plant trees is that we oftentimes have a tendency to plant it improperly, and that's because too often what we do is we plant the package and not the tree that's within the package. And so in this particular case, we have what is called a balled and burlapped tree. This is soil that came from the nursery, and the tree was growing in it, and they literally went in with some spades and they dug and lifted that tree, put it into the burlap, and then put it into the wire basket for transport. We are going to leave the wire basket on during our planting process, but we are going to remove all of the burlap and the twine that's on the surface of it. So this is my package. When I create my planting site, I want my planting site to be 2 to 3 times the size of this package in terms of diameter, and I want it to be more like a saucer than a straight-sided hole that's going down into the ground. The other thing that we have to concern ourselves with is the depth at which we're going. The biggest problem that we have when we plant trees, because we plant the package, is that we oftentimes plant them too deeply. But here's the instructions that I give to people when they ask me how to plant a tree. I say the trunk goes above ground and the root system should be in the ground, and there's a transition zone between the trunk and the root system. Go walk out into the forest. Ask your kids to draw a tree. They're going to draw a tree that flares at the bottom as it transitions from trunk into root tissue. If I plant this tree too deeply, I'm putting the trunk underground. And so what I want to be able to do is identify where that flare is between the trunk and the root system, and make sure that that flare is slightly above the grade in which I'm planting this tree. So how do I go about doing that? Well, city of Stevens Point always marks their trees with a little bit of a wire flagging here. And I'm going to use this flagging to actually identify in the root ball where the root system begins. And so when I poke down there, I've got this much soil on top of that root system. And some really interesting works out there. Even 1 inch of soil over the top of a root system can create a situation that we call a stem girdling root. The roots of the tree and the stem of the tree cannot graft together. All right? If the root comes in contact with the stem, it will start to pinch it off, to girdle it, and that could cause a problem down the line. Typically when we get stem girdling roots, they start to affect trees about 15 to 20 years after they're planted. Just when they're starting to get to that point where we're getting all their environmental and aesthetic benefits associated with them, then they start to decline. So I want to be able to make sure that that root system is going to be exactly at the height that I want it to be. And so I identify where that is within the package before I roll it into the hole. And what I found is that I've got about 2 to 3 inches of soil that are over the top of that root system. So what I'm going to do is measure, and I can use my shovel to get this. I'm going to measure the depth of my planting hole that I've created, that planting site, and I'm going to align it with the top here. And what I can see is that if I take that 2 to 3 inches off, I'm just about perfect for my depth that we have here. I may have to make a little bit of an adjustment, but for by and large, I've got the tree depth about right as a result of that. So here's my package, the Baldwin burlap tree in burlap, in wire. We're gonna leave the wire on. We're gonna remove the burlap from the top of this. We've estimated where the root system is that's coming off of the trunk of the tree, and we adjusted our planting depth within our planting site hole to accommodate that. The next thing you can see is that we've got the tree that came from the nursery, and you can see that the top of this thing has been wound up with twine. They do this for transport. They don't want those branches blowing everywhere, so what they do is they tie them up. We're going to take this off before we roll our tree into the hole, because if we don't, some instances it might be very hard to get that twine off, so it's always a good idea to cut it off beforehand. When we take this twine off and we open that crown up on it, we can oftentimes then see if there are any damaged or broken or dead branches on here. So in this particular case, I've got a branch that's down here that's broken. I can remove that branch with relative ease when it's still laying on its side, as opposed to some point that might be way above where I can reach. So it becomes a little bit easier to take it off at that point. Generally, when I'm planting trees, I do not do any pruning at the time of transplanting. I will always wait a year or so before I go in and do any type of live limb removal on a tree that I'm putting in the ground. I can take off dead branches, broken branches, but I don't take off any live branches at the time of transplanting. Now that I have my package unfurled, I got an idea of what that crown might look like. So I'm going to take off this broken branch. It was broke right here at the base. I'm going to take that off. And now I've got an idea of what the shape of my tree might look like. And now when I'm putting it into the ground, I can actually turn it and rotate it to the point where its face is being oriented in the best location possible. Now what we're going to do is we're going to roll the ball into the planting site. And it might be really tempting here to reach down here and grab this part of the tree, because now I've got a big huge lever by which to roll that ball into the planting site. The problem is that when I start yanking on this end right here, I'm actually putting force at where that tree goes into the ball. And what that'll do is it'll kind of break the connection. One of the benefits that we have with a balled and burlap is the tree roots come in contact with the soil. It's delivered in that mechanism. If I start really yanking on it, I'm breaking some of that root to soil contact. So I want to be very careful about maintaining the integrity of that ball as I'm rolling it into the planting site. So when I do this, we're going to be working down here and we're going to roll it in. There we go. And then we can come down here and push and get it kind of leveled and spaced in here. Rotate, there we go, just a little bit more. That sounds good. And then we can stand her up straight. You can let her go once and see, that's not bad. So I mentioned a little bit earlier that we estimated the depth of that planting site by measuring where the root system was, and we said that that wanted to be a little bit, and that when you look at this ball, the tree, when we try to rotate this in a vertical position, is still. So I think what we might end up having to do is dig a little bit down. Right now it's about 3 inches, and I only want it to be about 1 inch to 1.5 inches above the grade, so we might dig a little bit underneath there. Yeah, take it more so from the bottom, so that if you look, that's not bad right there, huh? There you go. Better, good. You might notice that I'm throwing all the soil onto the tarp. That's because Todd Ernster, the city forester for Stevens Point, is really, really particular about the cleanliness of his sites after planting. So we try to maintain that cleanliness for him by putting the soil on the tarp. I think what we have is a pretty good planting depth here now all around. And what we're going to do is remove all of that burlap and twine that's on the top of the ball. We want to pull it away from the trunk of the tree. Oh, yeah. So if you wanted to just, a lot of times they put nails in when they're balled and burlapping the trees, and I just take the nails off and I throw them in the hole. That's not going to be anything detrimental to the tree. Nor is the wire basket, or at least the preliminary work that's been done on this wire basket has indicated that it doesn't really adversely affect the health of the tree all that much. Now what we can do is that we can bend some of these things down if they appear to be like they might stick above, because we're going to lower this thing down a little bit or lower the top of the grade. And so when we pull this back, you can see that you go, boy, Les, you know, you told us to find that root system on this. All of these roots that you're seeing on the top, these are what are called adventitious roots. These are roots that have formed after they plant the tree. This point right here is actually a graft union on this tree when it was produced. So I'm going to cut those roots off, and you can see down low right here in this area, these are kind of where those big scaffold roots right here were when that tree was planted. And these are all roots that formed after this tree was cultivated or put into the nursery. Yeah, so all I'm going to do is just kind of pull this, try not to injure the trunk too much. Yeah, you can see right here. So yeah, right there is where that root system, that scaffold root system is. And so all of these roots were formed as they were maybe cultivating in the nursery, doing some weed control or whatever. Oftentimes when they're growing trees in a nursery, what they'll do is they'll cultivate between the rows, and some of the soil gets thrown up over on top of the root system. So all of these roots right here are these new roots that I can prune off because they're not part of that original root system. And what we've done is now just identify that root system right there as being where that transition from the trunk tissues to the root tissues are going to be, and we said we wanted that transition between 1 to 2 inches above the grade of the soil. And that's almost exactly where we are. So I'm going to prune these off. So what we've done at that point, let's just say I went in and left it. They would die off if I didn't, because I'm going to leave them above grade, and so they would just functionally die off. So pruning them off just kind of gets rid of them right now. But one of the problems that if I just planted the package, in other words, didn't scrape off all this soil, those roots are going to be growing in the upper part of the soil. And then as the trunk of the tree increases in diameter and the increase in diameter of the roots, they come together. And then they start compressing on one another. So I've just really said, you know what, I'm going to make sure that my trunk tissue is above grade and my root tissues are below ground. That's all I've done. There we go. And like I said, you can start seeing where that scaffold root system is starting to flare up, and right now it's just slightly above that grade. All right, we've got our tree situated. You'll notice that potentially it's not quite as vertical as what we want it to be, so we're going to make some final adjustments to get this thing straight up. Once again, Todd Ernster, the city forester for Stevens Point, is really particular about his trees being in a perfectly vertical fashion. So we're going to spend some time adjusting this, and we're going to use shovels. Remember, I told you that it would be really easy for me just right here, right now, to grab and pull this thing and straighten it. I don't want to do that. I've loosened up all that burlap. Now is when I could really be kind of dislodging that tree from those connections. So I'm going to be down here, and we're going to put a little bit of soil in to get this thing kind of in a straightened fashion. And quite often I can just use my shoulder to push it over, and you can see I've got a little bit more vertical, and we can just backfill. There we go, underneath this area to hold her. Okay, so we can backfill over here too. Just get it. All right, let's backfill. Okay. Because ideally what I'd like to do is I water as I'm backfilling, just to get that water to use the soil. The tendency is going to want to be to really pack this soil down when you're stepping on it. I don't want to jump up and down on this and over compact the soil. So quite often if I'm planting at home, I'll just take the hose out and I'll kind of lightly water as I'm backfilling and let that water settle the soil in. We're fortunate we live in an outwash plain. The soils here are fairly light. There we have a tree that's planted, and you can see that root flare sticking above the ground. That's what we're trying to achieve, making sure that those stem tissues are located above the ground, above the grade, and that the root tissues are actually going to be below ground, and I won't get that kind of girdling forming in the future. This is a Baldwin burlap tree. That big ball that was on the bottom, it provides a pretty good anchorage for this tree to stay in place. But many communities will stake these trees in addition to that ball. And so what we're going to do is we're going to put some stakes up on this tree. Typically we run those in a fashion that is up and down the boulevard or the corridor where you're planting. So in this particular case, they're going to run east and west. So we'll put 2 stakes here and we'll stake the tree, and then afterwards we can talk about mulching. Work in an area where we can see their walking dogs and everything else around here. I don't like to have this wire sticking out and pointing in all directions, so I like to fold it back in on this backside and then twist it off. And then what I do is I get rid of any sharp pointy ends that are there. So I've got those knobs holding it on the backside, and I'll show you how I tighten this thing here just in a little bit here. So now if I just twist this on the backside, it'll hold it into place. And you might say, boy, this isn't doing a whole lot right here. Well, I'm going to get rid of this stuff right here first. And then when I want to twist this thing, what I'm going to do is I'm just going to simply hold this, and now I can tighten this just in this fashion like this. And so now I've got kind of a tightened this. Okay, and we do the same thing on the other side. So now that we've got the tree staked, I should talk a little bit about staking and why we do it. Really what we're trying to do is just provide a little bit of support for this tree during the establishment period. Given the fact that we're in the middle, towards the end of October, this tree isn't going to be doing much root growth for the remainder of this year. All right, so we're going into the dormancy period. So this adds a little bit of extra support. Typically when we put stakes on, we leave them on for one growing season. The idea being is that those roots are going to start penetrating into the soil, and once those roots start doing that, that provides the anchorage. I can actually impede root development if I leave these stakes on too long. So generally we recommend just one growing season, and then you remove these stakes, and the tree should be sufficiently anchored into the soil through root growth that's going to be associated with the things that we just put in the ground. So yeah, very good. The last step that we have when it comes to pruning trees is, and I'm a firm believer and I talk to people about this, we have a perfect model that's out there as to what we should be doing to trees. Just go walk through any woods. You can see how trees want to grow. You talk about their flare that comes out, right, between the trunk and the root system. If you go into the forest, one of the things you also notice is that quite often there is an organic layer. Leaves and twigs and other organics accumulate on the surface of the soil. And that provides a critical point for nutrient cycling, for water retention, temperature modification. So the last thing that we're going to do is we're going to put down a layer of organic mulch over the top of this. Ideally, if this was a perfect world, what I would be doing is laying down a layer of compost, about a ½ inch to an inch of compost, and then I would put some coarser shredded bark, wood chips, or anything else over the top of this. Right now we're just going to put down a mixture of leaves and shredded up material over the top of this to kind of mimic that organic layer that forms naturally within a forested environment. So let's see if we can get this over. So what we've just done now is put down this layer of organic, generally about 2 to 3 inches of organics is probably going to be sufficient. It will continue to break down over time, and occasionally you can go back in and replenish that organic ring, kind of expand it as the crown of the tree is getting larger and larger. But yeah, this is ideally what you're doing with this is not only preventing moisture loss and modifying temperature and providing a source of organics that'll break down over time, you're also preventing a buffer for, if we look at it from a lawn maintenance, I suspect they probably come down here with riding mowers and the likes there. Now we've just given them a nice big radius to turn around that's fairly easy, and you aren't having to worry about mowing right up to the base of the tree. So we've got this nice organic ring that kind of acts as a buffer zone. When I put down the mulch, I want to make sure that it's not up against the trunk of the tree. And so you can see I've got 2 to 3 inches that are around here, and it's moved away from the trunk of the tree. I do not want to pile mulch up. There are instances where you see people piling mulch up at the base of the tree. Please avoid doing that. There are pathogens that could potentially be in that mulch. There's moisture and temperature that could start adversely affecting the trunk of the tree. So what we do is we pull that organic layer away from the base of the tree. Once again, go walk into the woods. You don't see a mound of leaves and bark at the base of the tree. All right, it's kind of evenly distributed across the forest floor. So the last thing that we put on here then was a weed whip, and this was just simply a plastic barrier that if they are coming through with any type of gas-powered or electric weed or grass trimmer, string trimmer, it's going to prevent them from beating up the trunk of the tree. And this is an expandable plastic that goes around, so it's not going to be like the tree is going to grow into it and you're going to have a tough time pulling it off. It'll keep pushing it out as the trunk is growing.